The time is the late 1880s. The setting is Austria, at a boarding station for a train that will travel across the Tyrolean Alps. There are two famous men waiting for this train. One of them is the emperor of the only monarchy that has ever existed in the New World. His name is Dom Pedro II, the ruler of the Empire of Brazil, at this time an old man in his early 60s. He is a polyglot, fluent in Italian and French. He is famously erudite, a bookworm from a young age. He greatly admires the cultures of the Old World and has visited Europe twice before. And though he is a monarch, well loved by his people, and nicknamed the Magnanimous, Pedro nevertheless feels that Brazil is inevitably on a course to establish a republic, and he welcomes this outcome. The other famous man waiting for this train is a German philosopher and former classicist, who now lives by himself and often travels between Switzerland, Austria, and Italy. His name is Friedrich Nietzsche. By this time, Nietzsche has not lectured for many years. He has already authored most of his major works. In a modern Europe that is rapidly liberalizing and feeling the political and social effects of industrialization, Nietzsche remains a stubborn advocate for the old aristocracies. But ultimately, he is not a political writer. He suggests instead that the great man should be allowed to stand aside from politics. His main philosophical project is to confront the revaluation of values that he sees rapidly coming upon the European civilization, the inevitable changes that will ripple through society following the collapse of old metaphysical and moral beliefs. Both men knew, on some level, that the end was coming, though neither could have known how imminent it was. Nietzsche had often predicted that he would suffer the same fate as his father, who died of a mysterious illness. And though Nietzsche couldn't have known it, all that was left for him at this point would be to write his final works in Turin, his final essays on Wagner, his late opus The Twilight of Idols, and his autobiographical work Ecce Homo. By January of 1889, Nietzsche would go completely insane and never recover. As for Pedro, he would soon abdicate his throne. He was more or less forced out of office by the military upon returning from this trip, an inevitability which he accepted with equanimity. He would die of old age shortly thereafter. But in this moment, neither man is aware of their fast-approaching fate, and on the train, Nietzsche surprisingly strikes up a conversation with the Brazilian emperor. The historian Pedro Calmon writes about this, stating that as the emperor traveled, quote, "A German with a thick Gallic mustache who knew Gobineau and Wagner started talking to him, like two tourists who were brought together by chance of their trip, both loquacious." End quote. Who knows what they spoke about? Perhaps they conversed in French, the language for which both had the most overlap in competency. Both were also well-versed in philosophy, literature, and music. And to make matters more interesting, Nietzsche didn't even know who he was speaking to until the end of the conversation, when the two men were about to go their separate ways. When he finally learned from one of Pedro's attendants that he was speaking to the Emperor of Brazil, according to one version of the story, the two men hugged. Thus, this is an extraordinary and, dare I say, fated meeting between Nietzsche, a definitive figure in the history of 19th century German philosophy, and Pedro II, perhaps one of the most important political figures of the 19th century Western Hemisphere. But, unfortunately, it never happened. Before we discuss why this incident is almost certainly fake and why the story was made up, we should take a moment to appreciate that it is a good story. It's the kind of historical crossover like the time Harry Houdini had dinner with H.P. Lovecraft, or the time that Kaiser Wilhelm went horseback riding with Teddy Roosevelt, that just excites the imagination. These are the kinds of meetings that I wish I could be a fly on the wall to witness. As far as potential meetups go, Nietzsche and Pedro II are similar in many fascinating ways, and different in just as many fascinating ways. When it comes to their personal background, both men had to part with their father at a very young age. As mentioned, Nietzsche's father died of an unexplained illness when he was only 5 years old, and shortly thereafter so did his younger brother. He was raised by his mother and his two aunts, and his younger sister was his only sibling. Pedro II's father also left him when he was a child. In this case, not because of an early death, but because he had to return to Portugal in order to reclaim the throne Accordingly, Pedro I abdicated the throne of Brazil, and Pedro II was made monarch under a regency, again at only 5 years old. He would never see his father ever again. His only companions in life were his 2 sisters and the mentors and servants who brought him up. Both men spoke many languages, read voraciously, and felt solitary their entire lives. In Nietzsche's case, because he found himself obsessed with ideas that others could not understand. For example, his old mentor, Jacob Burckhardt, the famous classicist, was somewhat disturbed when he read Nietzsche's book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In Pedro's case, it was because of his office, held from the time he was a child, that isolated him from the rest of his subjects. Even from his 2 sisters, whom he loved very dearly, but who could not understand the burdens placed on the young man by his position. Both men also had a common interest in the arts, specifically the music of Richard Wagner. And while the story of the 2 men meeting and having an involved conversation in a train car crossing the Alps is almost certainly fictional, as we'll examine in a bit, Nietzsche and Pedro II nevertheless were at the same place at the same time at the Bayreuth Festival of 1876. Wagner was one of the most popular composers in Europe. He had gathered a considerable movement in Germany, and the town of Bayreuth was intended to become the center of that movement. The festival would be its annual gathering. 1876 was the inaugural year, and Wagner had been preparing for it for the entire duration of his friendship with Nietzsche, whom he'd met while the young Nietzsche was beginning his professorship at Basel University in 1869. Wagner had commissioned the construction of a new opera house, and Nietzsche himself had been there while the first foundation stones were laid. When the festival was finally held in 1876, musicians, politicians, and other celebrities and luminaries were in attendance. These included Emperor Wilhelm I, King Karl of Württemberg, King Ludwig II of Bavaria, as well as Leo Tolstoy, Franz Liszt, Peter Tchaikovsky, and Edvard Grieg. One of the luminaries in attendance was none other than Emperor Dom Pedro II on his first visit to Europe. According to one story, to illustrate Wagner's eccentricity, Wagner stood on his head while greeting the emperor. By all accounts, Pedro had a wonderful time there. In fact, he was one of the festival's financial backers. One of Wagner's noble goals in creating the festival was to combat the commercialization of art and culture, and thus he'd sought financing from patrons of the arts rather than attempting to run the festival as a profiteering enterprise. This inaugural festival is somewhat notorious, especially among readers of Nietzsche, because he wrote of the horrific time he had while in attendance there. Nietzsche's migraines flared up, he didn't like large crowds, and he was put off by the vulgar nationalism and Lutheran overtones among Wagner's fan base. While it is not impossible that the 2 men met there, it is highly unlikely that they would have had an involved conversation, and neither man records it in his letters or personal writings. Given Nietzsche's condition and the fact that he spent most of the festival with headaches and in crippling pain and left halfway through, it probably wouldn't have been the best time for Nietzsche to have a long, in-depth philosophical conversation anyway. That being said, their shared acquaintanceship with Wagner and love of his music could easily have provided the spark to strike up a conversation, supposing that they did meet later. And it is here that we come back to the train story. Where does the story of the 2 men meeting on a train or at a boarding station come from? The first time the story appeared in print was in an Austrian magazine dated June 17, 1912. It is attributed to an anonymous author. Quote, "One day, the poet of Zarathustra crossed the Tyrolean Alps. At a boarding station, he met a robust, broad-shouldered man who, from his habits and accent, seemed to belong to an exotic country. The foreigner struck up a conversation with Nietzsche. That reserved man, thanks to the fascination of the Brazilian's interesting personality, opened up and confided in the foreigner, whose status he didn't know. The emperor offered the philosopher a place in his carriage. The 2 embarked on a journey over the mountains, and Nietzsche considered those hours among the most interesting of his life. At the next station, Nietzsche disembarked while his companion continued his journey. He asked an employee for information about the name of that gentleman who, judging by the reverence that everyone showed him, must have been a high-level Spanish dignitary, and he was no less surprised to learn that he had met the Emperor of Brazil." End quote. Many versions of this story would be repeated over the years, but the first version is a bit unusual for a couple of reasons. First, because it is anonymous, and secondly, because this same story would be related by Count Maurice Prozor, in a publication that same year. Prozor said the story he related was told to him in a letter from Elizabeth Nietzsche. So where did this anonymous publication come from before Prozor or Elizabeth went public with the story? We may never know, but some speculate that it comes from Elizabeth herself. The other thing we might notice from this anonymous story is that it is shy of certain details that would be very helpful for determining its veracity. We don't get the year, for example, or the time of year. And as we continue to see how this story is retold over the years, one of the things that never stays consistent is the year that this meeting supposedly happened. Prozor's own account, while very similar to the anonymous one that we just read, is worth taking a look at. For one, because it has certain similarities in diction, suggesting that it was either plagiarized from the anonymous account, or perhaps that the accounts derive from the same source. Furthermore, some of Prozor's embellishments might reveal to us what might very well be the motivation behind coming up with a story like this. Here is Prozor's account. Quote, "One day, crossing the Tyrol, the author of Zarathustra meets, at a station, a traveler with a white beard, striking features, and exotic speech. And he who was fleeing from strangers soon feels fascinated by the great old man with a communicative demeanor, at times authoritarian and benevolent. The artist in Nietzsche was first seduced, then the philosopher, as the conversation became more accentuated. Thus, the interlocutor promptly offers him, to continue, a place in his cabin, and Nietzsche's usual recalcitrance dissipates, and he allows himself to be taken over by the charm of the wise man from beyond the sea, who does not reveal himself to him, and who, for his part, seemed to find special pleasure in this encounter. They separate at the next stop, and Nietzsche, who gets off at the town while his companion continues on his way, asks the name of the foreigner, who he considered to be a figure of respectable character and expression. So you don't know that this is the Emperor of Brazil, the postcard responds, particularly astonished upon seeing him following the Emperor, without knowing who he had traveled with. I quote this curious episode that Miss Fuster Nietzsche told me because of the symbolic value of this meeting under the Alps of two elite beings who embody the ideal they carry in mind." End quote. Certain details and phrases reappear in Prozor's account of the supposed meeting, such as beginning the story by referring to Nietzsche not by name, but as the author of Zarathustra in one version, the poet of Zarathustra in another. Then the detail of the exotic accent of Dom Pedro. These choices of diction indicate to me that there may be a direct link between this anonymous source and Prozor's account. But we might also notice something which is far more overt in Prozor's retelling. The language here hints at a certain vibe. Two elite souls high up in the Alps. A meeting between the sole aristocrat of the New World and the last philosopher of aristocracy in the Old World. Geraldo Diaz wrote an article in which he reviews the various iterations of this story. And to give him full credit, I've used his article as the main source for this video. Although I was only able to find it in Portuguese, Diaz suggests the reason for the enduring power of this tale, especially within Brazil. While the Brazilian monarchists are a small political faction, they are far more significant than a monarchist faction might be in, say, America, and the monarchists of Brazil very much enjoy this story because it elevates the mythos of their last emperor. We can easily see the tinge of Prozor's monarchism on his writing, all the way back in this, the first attributed account of this story. Now, I'm not going to go through an exhaustive account of all of these different versions of the tale. There are some interesting similarities and differences that we could look at, but if we look at the stories for all of those different versions, they all come back to these initial publications in 1912. When we look for the original sources, it all comes back to Elizabeth Nietzsche and Count Maurice Prozor, who, as he said, got his version of the tale from Elizabeth Nietzsche herself. That being said, there is an interesting variation on this tale of a meeting between Nietzsche and Pedro that takes place in a completely different setting and time. This story also sources to Elizabeth Nietzsche. In this new version, she cites a letter that Nietzsche wrote to Erwin Rohde from Switzerland, dated August 28, 1877. Nietzsche refers to some of his recent piano compositions and the fact that he recently played them in a hotel to an audience of no one. Quote, "When, a few days ago, I sang my hymn to solitude in my heart, I suddenly had the impression that you didn't like my music, and you energetically asked for a song to solitude for two. The same night I played one, as best I could, and in such a way that all the angels would have been able to listen with pleasure. But this happened in a dark room, and no one heard." End quote. Elizabeth then adds her commentary on this letter. Quote, "My brother's observation that his improvisations at the piano would not have been heard was based on an error. It was later discovered that a very curious listener was standing at the quietly opened door. It was Dom Pedro, Emperor of Brazil, who would have been deeply moved by the miraculous execution. The next day they both met on a common ascent, without my brother having the slightest idea who it was. The stranger expressed to my brother his gratitude for the splendid show, and this was followed by a long and interesting talk. Only after they had both separated did my brother know who the stranger was, treated by everyone as he had observed with so much respect." End quote. So, rather than on a train, Elizabeth Nietzsche has Dom Pedro and Nietzsche meet at a hotel and then while mountain climbing, and once again, neither knows who the other one is. As Geraldo Dias writes, Elizabeth's account, quote, "had repercussions in Brazilian historiography, literary criticism in the press, in addition to also producing effects in the foreign press." End quote. Importantly, Dias adds to this, quote, "Let us note that in the first biography that Elizabeth wrote, Das Leben Friedrich Nietzsche's, she transcribes the letter in full, and does not mention anything about the story of her brother's meeting with Dom Pedro II. End quote. If we recall, the story about the two meeting on a train first appears in the press in 1912. 2 years later, now that the stories about Pedro and Nietzsche meeting had begun to pick up steam within the zeitgeist, Elizabeth remembers this detail about Nietzsche's life that she never included before. As Dias notes, by December of 1925, quote, "On the occasion of the centenary of the birth of Dom Pedro II, among articles and studies about him published in national diaries and periodicals, there are different references to the story of his meeting and conversation with Nietzsche, almost all signed by conversational intellectuals and uncompromising defenders of the monarchical cause." End quote. None of these new retellings from the 1920s onward offer any new evidence corroborating the story. Instead, we have secondary sources who cite Prozor's account in the anonymous publication, and then tertiary sources who cite the secondary sources. There are little variations that appear and embellishments as the story continues to be retold, but never the uncovering of new sources that could inspire confidence that it actually took place. Now, at this point, some of you may be wondering, is it still possible that the story is true? The evidence for it may be bad, but that's not the same as no evidence. And as a matter of intellectual honesty, it's worth noting that Nietzsche and Dom Pedro II actually crossed paths quite a few times. Not just the one time in Bayreuth. But the unfortunate caveat for those of us who would like the story to be true is that we don't have any indication that the two men actually conversed during any of these times. Dias examined all the evidence we have for references to Brazil or Pedro II in Nietzsche's work and his letters. He lists all of the times in which Nietzsche outright says that the two men were at the same place at the same time. Dias writes, quote, "The first letter in which he made reference to Pedro was written on August 7, 1877, from Rosenlauibad, Switzerland, where he was on vacation. Sent to his sister, he reports, 'Here at the hotel were also the Emperor and Empress of Brazil.' 3 days later, with more details, Nietzsche writes another letter now addressed to his mother in which he states, 'Furthermore, here at the hotel was the Emperor of Brazil, accompanied by 17 people.' On August 10, 1877, he wrote another letter to his sister, stating, 'The Emperor and Empress of Brazil were here at the hotel.'" End quote. This has to be the basis for Elizabeth's later embellishment that the Emperor overheard Nietzsche playing the piano at the hotel. But this is a detail that Nietzsche does not mention in either of these letters that he sent to his sister. It seems extremely odd that he would note that the Emperor of Brazil was there, but not that he listened to Nietzsche play piano and that the two later went mountain climbing together. Why didn't Nietzsche ever mention this anecdote to anyone else, and why did no one bring it up, including Elizabeth herself, until 1914? Suffice to say, we have no record of these meetings in the Emperor's writings or correspondences either. Dias continues, quote, "The fourth and last reference to Dom Pedro II dates from January 6, 1888, present in the letter sent from Nice to Peter Gast. In it, he tells his friend that last Thursday I made my first visit to Monte Carlo to attend a concert, in which the Emperor of Brazil was also present. Therefore, neither his body of work nor Nietzsche's letters offer proof that he actually met and spoke with Dom Pedro II. The letters could confirm that their two lives, in passing and at a distance, crossed paths 3 times. First, in Bayreuth in 1876. Then, in the summer of 1877, in Rosenleuebad, Switzerland, noting the use of the verb in the past tense, was, to refer to the presence of Dom Pedro II and the difficulty of approaching a meeting and dialogue when the emperor was accompanied by 17 people. Finally, they attended the same music concert on January 5th, 1888, at the theater in Monte Carlo. End quote. That final crossing of paths in Monte Carlo has offered the last hope for historians attempting to reconstruct the circumstances of this fabled conversation. Remember at the beginning of the video when I used the source Pedro Calmon to flesh out the dialogue between Pedro II and Nietzsche? Well, what Calmon was doing was picking through letters and journal entries from both men to try and reconstruct their activities in Europe and determine when they could have crossed paths, and from that find a plausible date for a meeting that he assumes happened. Calmon, like every source after 1914, does not introduce any new evidence. He is simply operating from the premise, if this meeting did happen, then where and when would it have had to have happened for it to be plausible? Eventually, the only plausible date that he settles on is April 2nd, 1888. But he places the meeting in a train car traveling in the south of France, not in the Alps. The full quote is as follows, quote, Dom Pedro left the Riviera on April 2nd, escaping the wave of recent friends who appeared to embrace him at the station. How many aristocrats summered there? At the next stop, Nice, he took the same carriage, and there sat next to him a German with a thick Gallic mustache who knew Gobineau and Wagner, who started talking to him. Along the Ligurian coast where the railway runs between landscaped terraces and the Indigo Sea, they cavorted to their heart's content, like two tourists who were brought together by the chance of their trip and a cabin in Nice, both loquacious. End quote. The main problem that Calmon faces in trying to reconstruct a maybe, perhaps plausible account is the very fact that the basis of the entire story are those accounts from 1912 and 1914, both of which say this meeting happened in the Alps. It would be one thing if the location of the meeting in those first accounts had been left ambiguous along with the year, but as the situation stands, in order to accept Calmon's account, we would have to disregard one of the only consistent details about those early tellings of the story. Furthermore, Calmon himself admits, quote, in his diary, Dom Pedro failed to note this fortuitous conversation with Friedrich Nietzsche, end quote. It's also worth noting that Nietzsche would almost certainly have mentioned such a thing in his letters. If he'd had an involved philosophical conversation with the Emperor of Brazil, Nietzsche would have told one of his friends, Peter Gast, Erwin Rohde, Franz Overbeck, Helen Zimmern, Meta von Salis, someone. But there's nothing. If we go back to where this whole thing started, that anonymous publication in 1912, the author says that Nietzsche found this conversation, this meeting with Pedro II, to be one of the most interesting encounters in his entire life. But whenever we encounter evidence that the two were in the same place at the same time, all we get in Nietzsche's letters is, in the example of the letter sent to Gast in 1888, quote, the Emperor of Brazil was also present, end quote. That generally isn't the kind of thing you say to one of your best friends about one of the most interesting things that's ever happened to you. This is why, as early as the 1940s, some had already begun to doubt the story. One such figure was Ernest Feder, an economist and historian. He was a Jew from Germany who had fled to Brazil to avoid persecution. The story of the meeting between Nietzsche and Pedro was so widespread in Brazil at that time that he more or less accepted the truth of it, saying that the details, as Elizabeth Nietzsche gave them, should be accepted. After all, she was Nietzsche's sister. But he writes, quote, it is surprising that none of these sources claim testimonies or other proof of the meeting. End quote. And further, quote, it is also curious that some speak of an encounter in Switzerland, others in Tyrol, some on a railway, others in an alpine expedition. End quote. But what should we conclude here in the modern day? Did Nietzsche and Pedro meet in the sense of being in the same place at the same time? Maybe even shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries? We can't rule that out. But did an involved philosophical conversation take place? Almost certainly not. As Diaz concludes his article, quote, in light of what is historically attested, it is concluded that a meeting and conversation between Nietzsche and Dom Pedro II did not take place in 1871 in a train carriage in Austria, nor in Bayreuth in 1876, nor in Rosenlauerbad in 1877, nor over the Tyrolean Alps in 1880, nor on the train between Nice and Genoa in 1888, nor at the music concert at the Monte Carlo Theater in 1888. End quote. So what is the point of this video then? I should say that I didn't set out to myth-bust the idea of Nietzsche meeting Pedro just for the sake of myth-busting it. I've made other videos going after common Nietzsche myths, but this one isn't quite so common, outside of Brazil that is. So I don't feel the urgent need to address it in the same way that I feel that urgent need with, say, the Turin horse story, that myth about Nietzsche that just refuses to die and is even repeated by supposedly reputable intellectuals and academics. The reason why I made this video is because I actually wish this meeting were true. Not because I have a burning need to restore the Brazilian monarchy, but because, as I said before, it's the kind of historical crossover that I love to read about and love to imagine experiencing. And it's precisely because I feel that way that I understand why fictitious biographical information like this continues to propagate through cultural mimesis. It is easy enough to say, why not just let people have their fun and believe in the myths? But if we find that we prefer the myths to the truth, we should ask ourselves why that is. This doesn't just apply to Nietzsche or Pedro or this meeting, but to many of the myths about famous people from history. So often, what we are doing in constructing a historical figure's biography is building a legend around them, according to how we feel about them in the here and now. We will even revise history in accord with those psychological needs, rather than deal with the cold, hard, sometimes boring facts. But that, in and of itself, is a reason to stick to the facts if we really want to understand history. We can acknowledge how cool it might have been had this conversation actually happened. And we can also acknowledge that it didn't happen. It's fiction. We made it up. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.